Stay here cleaning the house, Mom, because the beach vacation is just for us and the kids need space. I am Constance. I am 71 years old and I spent my entire life behind the lens of a camera as a studio photographer, capturing the flawless smiles of other people's families while holding my own together with tooth and nail. What my son forgot this morning, while he packed my savings into his suitcase and discarded me like an old piece of furniture, is that whoever develops the photograph always holds the original negative in their hands. The dawn had started like any other day in my house, or at least in the house that had once been only mine. The kitchen clock barely read 5:30 in the morning when my bare feet touched the cold tiles. At that hour, the silence is usually a gift, a brief pause before the hurricane of daily coexistence wipes away the peace. But today wasn't just any day. Today was the day of the big family trip. I had been preparing everything for weeks, anticipating the heat of the sun on my tired joints, imagining the ocean breeze I hadn't felt in over a decade. I tied the apron around my waist, the same linen apron with faded flowers that has accompanied me for years. My hands, marked by the stains of developing chemicals from my youth and the wrinkles of time, began their automatic dance. I pulled out the flour, the eggs, the milk, and the butter. My grandkids, Hudson, who is 7, and Sophie, who is 5, adored my pancakes, especially on holidays or travel days. It was a tradition I had established myself. As I beat the batter in the glass bowl, the rhythmic sound of metal against glass served as my anchor. I was the grandmother who cared for them. That was my identity, my armor, and until that moment, my greatest pride. Ever since Ray, my ex-husband, packed his things 15 years ago and walked out chasing a younger illusion, my world had shrunk and, at the same time, concentrated entirely on my son, Fletcher. The divorce didn't destroy me, but it hardened me in certain areas and softened me in others. I promised myself my son would never lack the warmth of a home, that his father's absence would be compensated with double the presence from me. I worked double shifts at the photo studio, shooting weddings, baptisms, communions, always standing, always smiling behind the viewfinder, to pay for Fletcher's college, to make sure this big house with its high ceilings remained our refuge. And that refuge threw its doors wide open 5 years ago, when Fletcher and his wife Lauren lost their apartment over a bad financial decision. They arrived with suitcases, cardboard boxes, and long faces, asking for asylum just for a few months, until they got back on their feet. The months turned into years. The boxes were unpacked, the guest room morphed into the kids' room, and my living room became the territory of plastic toys and discarded shoes. I didn't complain. On the contrary, my mother's heart saw the opportunity to have my blood close by. I took over the grocery shopping because kids' expenses are terrible, Mom. I started paying the water and power bills because Lauren hasn't found the job she deserves. Little by little, my pension and my lifelong savings merged into what Fletcher called the family fund. The smell of vanilla and melted butter started filling the kitchen. I poured the first ladle of batter into the hot skillet. The hiss of the liquid hitting the cast iron brought me back to the present. Upstairs, on the second floor, you could hear rushed footsteps. The dull thud of suitcase wheels dragging across the hardwood floor I had polished myself just last weekend. You could hear Lauren's high-pitched voice complaining that something didn't fit in her designer bag. A bag that curiously appeared in the house right after I gave them cash for Hudson's school supplies. I stacked the golden pancakes on a large ceramic plate, covering them with a clean cloth to keep the heat in. I squeezed fresh oranges, feeling the acid sting the tiny cuts on my fingers, the result of hours sewing school costumes that Lauren always forgot to order on time. I was the invisible safety net of this family, the one making breakfast, washing the clothes, financing the whims disguised as necessities. The idea for the trip had come up 2 months ago. Fletcher came home excited, showing me photos of a 5-star coastal resort on his smartphone screen. Mom, we need a break. It's been a tough few years. The kids deserve to see the ocean. He said it with that smile he knew would melt my defenses. He asked me to fund the adventure. You have those savings from the studio, Mom. I manage the banking app. I'll take care of all the bookings so you get a better deal. You just have to authorize the transfer to the central account. And I, blinded by love and the dream of walking on the sand with my grandkids, went to the bank, signed the papers, and transferred a considerable sum to that account he managed from his phone, even though legally it was still under my name as the primary account holder. I spent weeks getting ready. I went to the mall and bought a modest swimsuit, a wide-brimmed hat to protect me from the sun, and a pair of comfortable sandals. I packed my things in a humble green canvas bag that I tucked quietly in the corner of my room, ready to stay out of the way, ready to be the grandmother watching the kids at the pool while the parents rested. The footsteps reached the stairs. The kids ran into the kitchen, followed by Fletcher, who was hauling two massive suitcases, sweating and frowning. "Pancakes!" Hudson yelled, climbing onto the chair and grabbing one with dirty hands before I could offer him a fork. "Slow down, sweetheart. They're hot," I said softly, pouring him a glass of juice. Fletcher dropped the suitcases in the hallway with a heavy thud that rattled the door frames. He was wearing a white linen shirt I had ironed the night before, making sure the collars were perfect, without a single wrinkle. Lauren appeared right behind him, flawlessly made up at 6 in the morning, scrolling through her phone without even saying good morning to me. She sat at the table, pushed the plate of pancakes away with a gesture of disdain, and sighed. "Fletcher, are you sure you packed my creams in the checked bag? I don't want security taking them at the airport," she said, completely ignoring my presence. "Yes, honey, everything is in there," he answered, pouring himself coffee in a rush, spilling a few drops onto the clean tablecloth. I stepped up to the table, wiping my hands on my apron. I felt a flutter of anticipation in my stomach. "Well, I already have my green bag ready upstairs," I mentioned with a smile, trying to blend into the frantic morning energy. "Do you want me to bring it down now so we can fit it in the trunk? I know the cab to the airport gets here in 20 minutes. The silence that followed my words was so thick you could almost cut it with the butter knife. Hudson stopped chewing. Sophie looked at me with her big brown eyes. Lauren looked up from her phone for the first time all morning. She shot a quick glance at Fletcher, then looked back down, letting out a small, sharp smirk. Barely noticeable, but lethal. Fletcher set his coffee mug on the table. He didn't meet my eyes. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous tic he'd had since he was a boy whenever he was about to lie or do something he knew he should be ashamed of. "Mom," he started, his voice dragging, like he was talking to someone who didn't understand the language. "There's been a change of plans." My smile froze, but it didn't vanish right away. Maternal instinct. That stubborn force that always tries to justify the child scrambled to find a logical explanation. A change of plans? Did they delay the flight? "It doesn't matter. I can keep the pancakes warm a little longer." "No, the flight leaves at the same time," Fletcher said, finally looking up. His eyes were cold, calculating, entirely stripped of the tenderness I had showered on him his whole life. "The change is about the tickets and the hotel." I took a step back, pressing my shoulders against the cool steel of the refrigerator. My breathing grew a little shallower. "I don't understand, son." Fletcher let out an impatient sigh, like I was a bureaucratic annoyance standing in the way of his perfect morning. "Look, the rooms at that resort are really expensive, and the flights, well, with the peak season, prices shot up. I had to adjust the budget, and frankly, Mom, at your age, a trip like this is just too exhausting. The sun, the sand, walking all day. You're going to get tired and you're going to slow us down." The words hung in the kitchen air, mixing with the sweet smell of breakfast. I felt a dull blow to the center of my chest, like the air had been knocked out of my lungs by an invisible impact. "But I paid for that trip, Fletcher." My voice came out low, without any shrillness. There was no anger yet, only a deep, massive confusion. The money I transferred was for a family trip. Lauren let out a short, dry, humorless laugh. "Please, Constance," my daughter-in-law said, using my first name with that condescension I had tolerated for years. It's family money. And right now, the family is Fletcher, the kids, and me. You already had your time to travel when you were young. We need this break. Besides, someone has to stay behind and watch the house. I looked at Fletcher, waiting for him to correct her. Waiting for the boy whose scraped knees I bandaged, the young man whose college I paid for by developing photographs late into the night, the man I opened my doors to when he had nowhere else to go, to step up and defend his mother. But Fletcher just shrugged, giving a slight nod to his wife's words. Lauren is right, Mom. Stay here cleaning the house. Because the beach vacation is just for us, and the kids need space. Take these days to rest. Oh, and don't forget, the trash gets picked up tomorrow. And the plants in the backyard need watering every afternoon. There was no screaming on my part. There were no tears sliding down my wrinkled cheeks. In that precise instant, while I watched my son's relaxed jaw and my daughter-in-law's triumphant glare, something inside me clicked off. And something else, much older and much colder, clicked on. I had been a woman of deep affections. I had loved my family with a devotion that bordered on absolute sacrifice. I had forgiven snubs, I had ignored minor disrespects, I had served hot meals and washed other people's clothes in silence, believing that unconditional love would eventually breed gratitude. But in that second, I realized my mistake. Unconditional love does not breed gratitude in selfish hearts. It breeds entitlement. It breeds the illusion that the person giving has no limits, no self-worth, and most dangerous of all, no power. My personality, forged in patience and constant care, didn't devolve into hysterics. Like the good photographer I always was, I simply shifted the focus. I adjusted the lens. I viewed the scene with clinical clarity, stripped of the foggy filter of blind motherhood. I stepped away from the refrigerator. My movements were slow, measured. I walked over to the sink, turned on the faucet, and washed my hands, scrubbing away every trace of flour and butter. I turned off the water. I grabbed a cotton towel and dried my fingers one by one, taking my time, forcing them to watch my silence. I understand, I finally said. My voice sounded so calm that even Fletcher looked thrown off for a second. They expected drama. They expected me to cry, to beg, to make them feel a fleeting pinch of guilt they would forget the second they boarded the plane. I didn't give them that pleasure. You understand? Fletcher asked, raising an eyebrow, clearly relieved he didn't have to deal with an emotional scene. That's great, Mom. I knew you'd be reasonable. It's for the best. Outside, the honk of the cab cut through the tension in the kitchen. Lauren jumped up, brushing non-existent crumbs off her perfect skirt. That's our ride. Kids, grab your backpacks. We're leaving. The chaos resumed. The kids ran toward the front door. Fletcher grabbed the heavy suitcases, struggling a bit with the weight. I watched him walk down the hallway, dragging the wheels over the hardwood I took such good care of. I watched him stop at the entrance. Mom, he called out without looking back. His voice rushed, his mind already somewhere else. I need to take the Platinum credit card, the one in your name. I linked it to the app. But the hotel sometimes asks for the physical plastic for the security deposit. You know how strict they are at those luxury places. I walked slowly down the hall. I went to the console table by the door, opened the drawer where I kept my documents, and pulled out the credit card. The very same one backed by the little capital I had left and by the paid-off mortgage of this very house. I held the plastic between my fingers for a second. I could have said no. I could have made a scene right there at the door. But my strategic mind, the one that spent decades calculating the exact lighting to make a portrait perfect, was already working 10 steps ahead of them. I handed him the card. Take it, I said, looking him dead in the eye. This time, he was the one who looked away first. Thanks, Mom. We'll call you when we get there, if we have a good signal at the beach. Don't tire yourself out too much cleaning. Lauren walked past me, leaving a trail of expensive perfume without saying goodbye. The kids yelled a bye, Grandma, from the back seat of the cab. Fletcher got in the passenger side and shut the door. I stood at the threshold of the house, feeling the cool morning air hit my face. I watched the vehicle pull away, kicking up a small cloud of dust on the quiet street until it turned the corner and disappeared from sight. I didn't raise my hand to wave. I simply watched, like a sentinel, watching the enemy abandon the fortress of their own free will. I turned around and went inside. The house was buried in a sepulchral silence, a brutal contrast to the noise of the last 5 years. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the silence of disrespect. I walked slowly through the living room. They had left 3 half-empty mugs of coffee on my oak coffee table, leaving circular moisture rings. In the hallway, a dirty pair of Hudson's shoes was tossed right in the middle of the walkway. I reached the kitchen. The plate of pancakes was still there, the spilled juice on the tablecloth, the dirty skillet on the stove, the mess they ordered me to clean. The physical testimony of my status as a servant in my own home. I ran my fingertips along the edge of the table. The sadness, the one that tried to choke me by the refrigerator, evaporated entirely, leaving in its place a cold, sharp, and absolutely ruthless clarity. They had taken my trip. They had insulted me to my face. They had used my love as a weakness. But Fletcher had made a monumental miscalculation. He grew up watching me serve, watching me cook, watching me yield, and he confused my service with stupidity. He thought that because he managed the modern app on his phone, he controlled the money. He completely ignored the fact that the master bank account, the original contract, and the security clauses of the fund were tied to my signature, my fingerprints, and my physical presence at the bank. He only had an extension, an illusion of power that I had granted him out of convenience and affection, a permission that could be revoked just as easily as flipping a switch. I didn't pick up the mugs. I didn't wipe the tablecloth. I didn't wash the skillet. I walked out of the kitchen and headed straight for the solid wood front door. I looked out at the empty street one last time. The sun was starting to heat up the asphalt. The vacation was just beginning for them. I pushed the heavy door, listening to the friction of the hinges. I gripped the brass knob firmly. The affection hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed locks. I slammed the door shut, and the metallic sound of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed down the empty hallway, marking the exact end of my submission. I was alone in the house, and I had exactly 12 hours before they reached the front desk of that 5-star resort. 12 hours to develop the true photograph of this family. The metallic echo of the deadbolt sliding into place bounced off the hallway, walls, and slowly faded, leaving absolute stillness in its wake. I stood in front of the solid wood door for a couple of minutes, my hand still resting on the cold brass knob. I didn't feel the trembling that usually accompanies massive disappointments. There was no lump in my throat, no suffocating pressure in my chest, like I had experienced so many times in the past when my family failed me. What I felt was an overwhelming lucidity, a mental sharpness you only get when you stop trying to focus a blurry image and instead change the lens entirely. I turned around and started walking through my own house. The hardwood floors creaked softly beneath my feet, a familiar sound that for 5 years had been masked by the kids shouting, Lauren's constant complaining, and my son's heavy footsteps. I walked through the living room. Hudson's plastic toys were scattered like landmines across the Persian rug I bought with my first big photography contract. The sofa cushions were tossed on the floor. The 3 half-empty coffee mugs were still on the coffee table, and a thick, dark drop slowly slid down the white porcelain until it stained the oak. Yesterday, that sight would have triggered a sigh of resignation before I went to fetch a damp cloth. Today, it was simply evidence. It was a crime scene I was no longer willing to clean. I walked down the hall to the back of the house, ignoring the kitchen and the plate of cold pancakes. I stopped in front of a dark wooden door I hardly ever opened these days. It was my old dark room, the sanctuary where I spent the late nights of my youth, turning strips of celluloid into indelible memories for other families. I pushed the door open. The smell of old chemicals, of fixer and photographic paper, still floated in the stagnant air, a time capsule welcoming me back. I flipped on the red safe light, the only light the main bulb allowed, and the room was bathed in a scarlet glow that turned shadows into solid shapes. I went straight to the old gray metal filing cabinet sitting beneath the unplugged enlarger. I crouched down, feeling the slight pop in my knees, and pulled out a small brass key I always kept hidden in the inner pocket of my apron. I unlocked the bottom drawer. There were no negatives in there. No strangers' wedding albums. There were thick manila folders organized with an alphabetical and chronological precision that Lauren, with all her disdain for my supposed modern ignorance, could never comprehend. I pulled out the folder labeled with the year my life changed for the first time. I sat on the wooden stool and opened it on the workbench. The first document was a bank contract with yellowing edges. Seeing that signature, my own signature, with younger, firmer strokes, dragged me 15 years into the past, with the force of a shutter firing in the dark. It was the morning after Ray left. I was 56, heartbroken, and staring at a stack of debt notices on the dining room table. Ray had drained our joint account before getting on a plane with his new illusion. I remember sitting in that very same kitchen chair, crying quietly so as not to wake Fletcher, who was 24 at the time and had just finished college. When my son finally came down for breakfast, he saw my swollen eyes and the bank papers. I explained, my voice breaking, that his father had left us with nothing, that we'd have to mortgage the house, that I'd have to work double shifts. I expected a hug. I expected my son, now a grown man, to tell me we would get through it together. Instead, Fletcher checked his watch, grabbed a piece of toast, and said, "Mom, keep me out of your drama. I have a job interview, and I'm running late. Fix it, you always know what to do." That afternoon 15 years ago, I dried my tears, went to the main branch of the bank downtown, and opened a master account solely in my name. I deposited the first payment from a series of 3 weddings I was shooting that month. I made the branch manager, a young guy in an immaculate suit, swear that no one but me would have power over those funds. I signed rigid security clauses, the kind that require physical presence and a fingerprint for any substantial modification. When Fletcher came home weeks later asking for cash for a down payment on a car, I told him no. He was furious, but I stood my ground. As the years passed, exhaustion and the desperate desire to keep my family together had softened me. When Fletcher returned, defeated 5 years ago with his wife and kids, I let him link a mobile app to a secondary account that fed off my master account. I gave him an extension on my Platinum credit card. I gave him the illusion of control because I wanted him to recover his dignity as a family man. But the master account, the financial heart of my entire estate, was still governed by the original contract I now held in my hands. I closed the folder. Nostalgia had no place in this room. Nostalgia is a deceptive filter that softens the edges of betrayal, and I needed the raw, high-contrast image. I stood up, turned off the red light, and walked out of the dark room. I went to my bedroom on the ground floor, took off my flour and butter-stained apron, and tossed it into the bottom of the laundry hamper. I opened the closet. I didn't reach for the comfortable grandma clothes Lauren bought me on sale to match my role as the live-in nanny. I reached into the back, where I kept the garments of the woman who built a business from nothing. I pulled out a dark gray linen tailored suit, a white silk blouse that still held the perfect crease from the dry cleaner, and sensible low-heeled shoes. I got dressed with the slowness of a soldier, adjusting her armor, before stepping onto a battlefield she knows by heart. I went to the vanity, pulled my white hair back into a tight bun, and applied a discreet but firm shade of red lipstick. I put on my authentic pearl earrings, the only ones Ray couldn't take with him. I grabbed my black leather purse, slipped the manila folder inside, and walked out of my room. I didn't look at the mess in the house. My mind was already miles ahead, calculating the trajectory of the strike. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The mid-morning sun was already beating down, signaling a sweltering day. As I walked down the tiled path toward the sidewalk, I heard the rhythmic clipping of pruning shears. On the other side of the low wrought iron fence was Margaret. Margaret was 73. She was a retired teacher and had been a widow for 2 decades. She was the kind of woman who watched the neighborhood with the precision of a hawk and had a tongue as sharp as the shears she used to decapitate the dead roses in her garden. We had known each other since Fletcher and his kids weren't even a blueprint. "Constance," she called out, lowering the shears and leaning against the fence. "Don't you look elegant? And how strange. I could have sworn I saw Fletcher and Lauren rushing out with the kids and suitcases the size of refrigerators just a couple of hours ago. I figured the cab forgot about you. You were going to the beach, right?" I stopped in front of her. I could have lied. I could have invented an excuse about a sudden stomach bug or urgent paperwork that kept me from traveling. That was the habit of mothers from our generation, covering up our children's flaws with the cloak of our own invention to save face. But the time for keeping up appearances ended the moment my son ordered me to clean the kitchen. "They didn't forget about me, Margaret," I replied, my voice sounding calm and level in the hot morning air. Fletcher decided at the last minute that my presence on the trip was an unnecessary expense and that the kids needed space. They informed me that my vacation would consist of staying behind to clean the house and water the backyard plants. Margaret dropped her shears onto the grass with a dull thud. Her eyes, framed by fine laugh lines, went wide. Disbelief quickly gave way to a silent, simmering outrage. The kind of solidarity-fueled fury that only another woman our age can fully comprehend. "They left you behind?" she asked, dropping her voice as if the words were too ugly to say out loud. "After you paid for every last cent of that damn luxury trip. Because I know very well Lauren hasn't worked a single day since they invaded your living room, Constance. They took the platinum credit card," I added, looking my neighbor straight in the eye. "Fletcher told me the hotel needed the physical plastic for the security deposit, and they left." Margaret pressed her lips into a thin white line. She looked at my house, eyeing the half-drawn curtains and the silence radiating from the property. "Constance, if you need us to go find a lawyer, my nephew is excellent. We can—" "I don't need a lawyer, Margaret," I interrupted gently, offering a smile that held not a single drop of joy. "I need to go to the bank, and I need you, if you see a moving truck, a cab, or any unknown vehicle stop in front of my house this afternoon, to call me immediately." Margaret held my gaze for a long second. She saw the cold determination in my posture, the gray suit, the leather purse tucked tight under my arm. A spark of recognition flashed in her pupils. She understood she wasn't talking to the resigned grandmother, but to the owner of the estate. "Not a leaf will move in your driveway without me writing it down in my notepad, Constance," she said firmly, picking up her shears. "Do what you have to do, and for the love of God, don't touch a single dish in that kitchen." "I wasn't planning on it," I replied, turning around to walk toward the main avenue. I hailed a cab at the corner. The ride to the financial district took about 20 minutes. Time I spent watching the heavy city traffic through the window. I thought about Fletcher. By now, they'd be boarding the plane. Lauren would probably be complaining about the legroom and coach, while Fletcher checked his phone, confident that the family fund, that magic well that never ran dry, would cover the trip's indulgences. The problem with people who have never had to build anything from scratch is that they are entirely ignorant of how foundations work. They see the finished building and believe it belongs to them simply because they live in it. The cab pulled up in front of the main bank branch. It was an imposing building with marble columns and revolving glass doors, a place designed to intimidate debtors and reassure creditors. I pushed through the door and walked in. The air conditioning hit my face, instantly cooling the sweat on my forehead. The murmur of financial transactions, the clicking of keyboards, and the hum of printers filled the massive lobby. I didn't go to the quick service teller windows. I walked straight to the commercial platform area, where mahogany desks replaced plastic counters. I approached the reception assistant, a young girl wearing a wireless headset. "Good morning. I need to see Ernest Sterling," I said, placing my hands on her desk. The girl looked at me with a hollow, professional smile. "Mr. Sterling is the branch manager, ma'am. He only takes high net worth accounts by appointment. Would you like me to direct you to a standard account executive? Tell Mr. Sterling that Constance Villeda is here," and tell him I am here to execute the security clause on the master account ending in 4729. The assistant blinked, thrown off by my tone and the precision of the numbers. She typed my name into her computer. Her expression changed drastically in a matter of seconds. The hollow smile vanished, replaced by a genuine attitude of service. Of course, Mrs. Velita. Just a moment. She picked up the phone, murmured a few words, and then stood up, gesturing the way with an open hand. Mr. Sterling will see you immediately in his office. Right this way, please. Ernest's office was at the end of the hall, behind a frosted glass door. When I walked in, he was already standing, buttoning his suit jacket. Ernest was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and impeccable manners. He had been the junior executive who helped me 15 years ago when I opened the account after Ray left. Now he was the branch director, but he had never forgotten who his founding clients were. Mrs. Constance, what a pleasant surprise. Please, have a seat, he said, offering me one of the leather chairs across from his desk. Can I offer you some coffee? Water? Water will be fine, Ernest. Thank you. I waited for him to hand me the cold glass of water. I took a sip, settled into the chair, and opened my leather purse. I pulled out the manila folder and slid it across the polished desk until it rested in front of him. Ernest, I'm not here on a courtesy visit. I need to make immediate, restrictive movements on my financial structure. He caught my tone. He sat down, put on his reading glasses, and opened the folder. He saw the original contract. Tell me what you need, Constance. You know I'm entirely at your disposal. First, I want to report the Platinum credit card ending in 8813 as compromised. I want it locked immediately, with no possibility of telephone or digital reactivation. Total fraud block. Ernest frowned, his fingers already flying across his keyboard. Was it stolen? Do you want us to file a police report? It wasn't stolen on the street. I handed it to my son, Fletcher, under the premise that it would be used to cover the expenses of a family trip that included me. This morning, my son decided to exclude me from the trip, leaving me with orders to clean up his mess. But he took the plastic, claiming he needed it for the hotel security deposit. I am withdrawing my authorization for the use of that credit line. If he tries to swipe it, I want the system to reject it irrevocably. Ernest stopped his hands over the keyboard. He looked up over the rim of his glasses, watching me with a mix of professional surprise and human understanding. He knew the history. He knew I had mortgaged and paid off this house with the sweat of my brow. Constance, if I flag the card as compromised with a hard block, the alert will trigger the moment they try to run a charge. If they are at a hotel and request a pre-authorization, not only will the terminal reject it, but the bank will freeze any other billing attempt tied to that plastic. They will be left without a physical line of credit. That is exactly the intention, Ernest. Proceed. The manager nodded in silence. The clacking of keys echoed in the closed office. Done. Platinum card blocked. Is there anything else? Yes. The secondary account linked to Fletcher's mobile app, the one we call the Family Fund. I see it here on the screen, Ernest said, adjusting his glasses. It has a considerable balance. It's the money you transferred 3 weeks ago for the coastal trip. I want you to empty that secondary account. Transfer 100% of the funds back to my individual master account. And then, I want you to revoke Fletcher's mobile app access to the master account. I want his phone to be a useless piece of glass when he tries to check my balances. Ernest leaned back in his chair, weighing the consequences of what I was asking. Constance, I understand your position perfectly. But I must warn you about something from an operational standpoint. If I move the funds now and revoke app access, the secondary account will be zeroed out. If your son tries to pay for the return flight, food at the hotel, or any emergency with the app he thinks he controls, the transaction will be denied for insufficient funds. They will be completely stranded with no physical card and no digital funds. I kept my posture straight. I didn't look away. The image of Lauren pushing my plate of pancakes away with disgust, and Fletcher's voice telling me, "Stay here cleaning the house," replayed in my mind with chilling clarity. Ernest, I am a 71-year-old woman. I spent the last 3 decades of my life making sure my son never lacked a roof, a hot meal, or financial backing. Today, he proved to me that my sacrifice didn't forge a grateful man, but a comfortable tyrant. Empty the account. The general manager asked no further questions. He printed out 3 sheets of paper filled with banking jargon, account numbers, and power of attorney revocations. He handed me a heavy, black ink pen. I read every line with my methodical mind, ensuring there were no legal loopholes. I signed the 3 pages with the same determination I used when I signed Ray's divorce papers. The black ink sealed the fate of my son's vacation. The funds have been transferred to your master account, Constance. The secondary account is at zero. The physical card is dead. The system takes about a couple of hours to update across the international network. By the time your son reaches the front desk of that 5-star hotel, he won't have a single cent at his disposal. Thank you, Ernest. I knew I could trust you. I tucked my copies into the manila folder. I stood up and shook his hand. I walked out of the bank feeling like the air was lighter, like my lungs were filling with pure oxygen for the first time in 5 years. I took a cab back to my neighborhood. I got home shortly after noon. The silence was still there, waiting for me. Margaret wasn't in her garden, but I noticed her living room curtains twitch slightly when I opened my front gate. She was watching. I went inside the house. The heat was starting to build up in the hallway, so I opened the living room windows to let the breeze move the stale air. I walked past Hudson's discarded shoes. I didn't pick them up. I went to the kitchen. The spilled orange juice on the clean tablecloth had dried, leaving a sticky, yellowish stain. The dirty skillet with the remnants of burnt butter sat on the cold stove. I poured myself a glass of tap water, leaned against the granite counter, and looked at the wall clock. 1:15 in the afternoon. The flight should have landed. They were probably grabbing those massive suitcases my son dragged across my hardwood floors. Suddenly, the silence of the house shattered. My cell phone, resting in the pocket of my gray jacket, began to vibrate and ring insistently. I pulled the device out. Fletcher's name flashed on the screen. I didn't answer on the first ring. I let it ring 3 times, feeling the weight of the plastic in my hand, savoring the absolute control of the moment. On the 4th ring, I slid my finger across the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello," I said, my tone neutral and calm. "Mom." Fletcher's voice sounded agitated, backed by the typical noise of a crowded airport. Loudspeaker announcements, rolling suitcases, the echo of hundreds of people. "You finally answer. We just landed. The kids are being unbearable. Lauren has a headache from the cabin pressure, and it took forever to get our luggage." "What a rough trip, son," I replied, deploying my best dry irony, the same tone he used to interpret as genuine maternal concern. "I can imagine how exhausted you must be." "Yeah, a disaster. Listen, we're walking to the cab line to head to the resort. I wanted to make sure of something. Did you clean the kitchen yet? Lauren left some things out of place, and she doesn't want it getting infested with ants. Also, remember to water the plants. They die fast in this heat." I closed my eyes for a second. The sheer audacity of his words was so immense it was almost fascinating. He was thousands of miles away, using my money, and he was still giving me maintenance orders. "Don't worry about the house, Fletcher," I said, opening my eyes and locking onto the juice stain on the tablecloth. "Everything is in the exact same place you left it. Not a single plate has been moved. Perfect. Oh, one more thing. I need you to open the banking app on your phone." The moment had arrived. The trap was about to snap shut. "The banking app? What for, son? You said you managed everything from your smartphone." Yeah, I manage it," he answered impatiently, raising his voice over the airport noise. "But sometimes, when making large payments in another city, the system asks for confirmation from the primary account holder's device. We're going to get to the hotel in about 40 minutes, and I need to put down the security deposit with the Platinum credit card and pay the first installment for the excursions with the fund on the app. I just want to make sure everything is in order. Did you make any transactions today?" I pushed off the kitchen counter. I walked slowly into the living room, eyeing the dirty coffee mugs. The symmetry of the moment was flawless. He had used his supposed technological and financial superiority to leave me behind, treating me like an underfunded maid. Now, that same technology was going to hit back with mathematical precision. Actually, yes, Fletcher, I said, my voice ringing as clear and cold as ice. I went out a while ago. I went to sort out some matters at the bank. At the bank? Why would you go physically if I have the app? Well, whatever. It doesn't matter. As long as you haven't touched the family fund, everything is fine. We'll see you in a few days, Mom. Rest up and scrub the upstairs floor well. Enjoy the hotel, son. I'm sure the reception will be unforgettable. And cut the call without waiting for my reply. I lowered the phone. The screen went dark. I sat on the living room sofa, ignoring the tossed cushions, and opened my own banking app. I typed in my security password. The screen lit up with my master account details. The balance reflected the entirety of my life's savings, secure, locked down, and absolutely inaccessible to anyone but me. I swiped down to see the secondary account, the famous family fund. Available balance, 0.00. Platinum card status, canceled by cardholder. I leaned back against the sofa cushions. I crossed my hands in my lap and let out a long, deep sigh. The wall clock kept ticking relentlessly. 40 minutes, Fletcher had said. 40 minutes, until the cab dropped them off at the glass doors of a five-star paradise they had no way to pay for. 40 minutes until the hotel manager informed my son that the maid he left cleaning his house had just quit, taking the keys to the kingdom with her. The real family trip was just about to begin. And me, for the first time in years, I had the best seat in the house to watch the fall. The ticking of the wall clock set the rhythm of my breathing in the living room. I sat on the couch with my back straight and my hands clasped in my lap, observing the space around me. The midday light filtered through the blinds, drawing lines of dust suspended in the hot air. In front of me, the oak table displayed the 3 abandoned coffee mugs, the dark stains already dried onto the polished wood. To my left, a mountain of garish plastic toys blocked the walkway into the hall. To my right, a pair of Lauren's designer shoes sat on my Persian rug, as if the mess were a rite of conquest. For 5 years, I had looked at this room and seen a family. I had forced my brain to apply a warm filter over the chaos, convincing myself that the mess was synonymous with life, that the exhaustion was the natural price of being the pillar for my blood. But now, with silence wrapping the house and the bank account secured, the filter had vanished. What I saw wasn't a home full of life. It was a scene meticulously constructed for my own servitude. I wasn't the respected matriarch. I was the domestic worker financing my own employers. In professional photography, there is a concept called depth of field. It is the zone of the image that appears sharp while the rest blurs into the background. For decades, my son Fletcher had been my only point of focus. Everything else, my needs, my exhaustion, the disrespect, remained blurry, thrown out of focus by my maternal instinct. But instincts can be deceiving if you refuse to look at the original negatives. The first time I noticed the blemish on the negative wasn't this morning. It was 25 years ago. Fletcher was 12, and the Christmas season had just ended. I had worked 14-hour shifts at the studio, photographing strangers' families in matching sweaters, just so I could buy him the imported mountain bike he had begged for. It was an absurd expense for our finances, but Ray, my ex-husband, insisted the boy couldn't have less than his private school friends. A week after Christmas, I found the bike dumped in the driveway, the chain broken and the frame scraped. Fletcher had dropped it to go play video games. When I confronted him and asked him to help me clean it and take it to the shop, Ray stepped in. "Let it go, Constance. He's just a kid. If it breaks, we'll buy another one. That's why you work so hard." I remember looking at Fletcher in that moment. There was no guilt in his 12-year-old eyes. There was a little twisted smile, a look of superiority aimed right at me. He understood, in that fraction of a second, that my effort had no value, that my labor was an inexhaustible resource at his disposal, and that he would never have to face the consequences of his carelessness. I took a mental photograph of that smile. I filed it in the darkest corner of my memory and forced myself to forget it. But the chemicals of memory always end up developing the truth over time. I stood up from the couch. The time for passive contemplation was over. The methodical mind that allowed me to build a business in an era when women rarely owned their own studios took absolute control of my limbs. I walked over to the landline in the kitchen, ignoring the plate of pancakes still sitting on the table. I picked up the receiver and dialed a number I knew by heart. The Padlock Locksmith. A raspy voice answered on the other end of the line. "Arthur, it's Constance Villeda. I need your services at my house immediately." "Mrs. Constance, so good to hear from you. Did you lock yourself out of the house again?" the old man joked. He had been running his little shop 3 streets over for 40 years. "No, Arthur. I'm inside. But I need to change the locks on the front door, the back door, and the garage gate. And I need you to install high-security cylinders. The computerized key kind that can't be copied at any hardware store." There was a brief silence on the line. Arthur knew my family. He had watched Fletcher grow up. "Did something happen, Mrs. Constance? Did someone try to break in?" "Something like that, Arthur. But the robbery ended today. Can you be here in 10 minutes? I'll pay double the emergency fee in cash." "I'll be there in 5, Mrs. Constance." "Have the coffee ready." I hung up the phone. I went to my room, took a wad of bills from the mechanical safe I kept hidden behind old photo albums in my closet, and went back to the living room. Just as I reached the hallway, the back doorbell rang. It was Margaret. My neighbor walked into the kitchen, pushing the screen door open. She was carrying a glass pitcher full of cold lemonade and 2 glasses. Her eyes scanned the mess in the kitchen with a mix of disgust and unified fury. "I saw you come back in a cab an hour ago," she said, setting the pitcher on the granite counter, far away from the spilled orange juice. "I figured you'd need something cold to drink, and maybe some help stuffing the trash that woman left all over your living room into garbage bags." I offered a tight smile. Margaret wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She was a tactical ally who understood the language of domestic survival. "I'll take the lemonade, Margaret, but we're not throwing anything in the trash. I'm not going to give them the destruction of property argument so they can play the victim. We are going to pack." Before Margaret could ask anything else, the front doorbell rang. I went to open it. Arthur was there with his heavy metal toolbox, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a cloth handkerchief. I let him in. For the next hour, the sound of drills, screwdrivers, and clashing metal replaced the oppressive silence of the house. Margaret and I sat on the kitchen stools drinking lemonade while we watched Arthur dismantle the old brass lock on the front door. The same lock Fletcher had given Lauren a copy of the day they moved in. As I watched the old cylinder drop into Arthur's palm, another negative from my memory developed before my eyes with painful clarity. It was 4 years ago. Lauren had been living under my roof for a year. I had gone out to buy fever medicine for my grandson Hudson, an expense that, of course, came out of my pocket. When I got back, I noticed the downstairs hallway looked different. I walked over to the large mahogany console I inherited from my grandmother. On it, I used to keep a collection of my favorite photographs in silver frames, black and white portraits of my parents, a picture of Fletcher when he was a baby, and a couple of landscapes I shot on my early travels. All the frames had vanished. In their place sat a massive, hideous modern ceramic vase, surrounded by fashion magazines, and a bowl to toss keys in. I found Lauren in the kitchen, filing her nails, while sipping a glass of wine I had been saving for a special occasion. I asked her about my photographs. She didn't even look me in the eye. "Oh, Constance," she drawled with her usual condescension. "I put them in a cardboard box in the garage. That console looked too gloomy, like a shrine for the dead. The kids need a modern environment with good energy. Besides, you're always in your little dark room. You can look at your photos in there." I went to the garage. I found the box. Someone had tossed a bag of dirty shoes on top of it, shattering the glass on my parents' portrait. I knelt on the cold cement floor. picking up the shards of glass with my bare hands. I cut my index finger. Blood stained the edge of the silver frame. In that moment, I should have thrown her out on the street. I should have taken the box, marched into the kitchen, and demanded she leave my property. But I didn't. I bandaged my finger, hid the box under my bed, and cleaned the blood in silence. I had justified her cruelty, thinking she was stressed about their lack of money, that she was a young mother trying to build a nest in a borrowed house. I had been a coward, dressed up as a martyr. The metallic click of the new lock sliding into the door snapped me back to the present. "All done, Mrs. Constance," Arthur announced, wiping his hands with a rag. "3 new locks, high security. Here are the only 3 copies of the keys. Not even with a professional lockpick are they getting this open without making a tremendous racket." I paid him the agreed amount, adding a generous tip. I walked him to the door and listened to the solid, definitive clack of the deadbolt locking from the inside. It was a beautiful sound. It was the sound of a restored boarder. I turned back to Margaret, who had already started picking up the plastic toys from the living room and tossing them into an empty cardboard box she found in the hall. "Leave that, Margaret. The toys are going into the room they used on the 2nd floor. What we are going to pack are the adults' belongings." I went to the utility closet and pulled out 2 massive rolls of thick, black plastic trash bags, the kind used for yard debris. I walked back into the living room. "What do you have in mind, Constance?" my neighbor asked, a spark of anticipation in her eyes. "We are going to clean the house, just like my son ordered me to," I replied, snapping the first bag open with a sharp flick. We started in the living room. I shoved Lauren's designer shoes into the bottom of the bag. Then, I went to the entryway console, grabbed all the fashion magazines, the absurd decorative bowls, and that damn modern ceramic vase. I shoved it all into the black bags. Margaret kept pace with me with military efficiency, clearing the coffee table, gathering the jackets Fletcher left draped over the armchairs, and emptying the hallway drawers, where they had hoarded years' worth of mail, trash, and receipts for useless purchases. We went up to the 2nd floor. The heat up there was more intense. The room that was once my pristine guest room was now a battlefield of unfolded laundry, cosmetics, scattered across the dresser, and half-empty suitcases they had decided not to take on the trip. I wasn't careful. I didn't fold Fletcher's linen shirts, nor did I separate Lauren's lace underwear. I grabbed entire piles of clothes straight from the shelves and dropped them into the black bags. I emptied the drawer of expensive cosmetics, paid for by the family fund, of course, and tossed them in along with the shoes. The sound of the plastic crinkling and filling with weight was the soundtrack of my emancipation. Margaret worked in silence, but her heavy breathing betrayed the satisfaction of the task. We filled 6 massive bags just with the things from the master bedroom. Then we moved to the shared bathroom. I cleared out all the exfoliating creams, the imported shampoos, and the electric razors. I stuffed everything into another bag. As I tightly knotted the black plastic of the 7th bundle, sweat slid down my forehead, and my hands stung. The physical exertion was exhausting for a woman my age, but the energy coursing through my veins was pure adrenaline. Every object I removed from my sight was a small victory, one less brick in the wall of humiliation they had built around me. We dragged the heavy bags down the stairs, step by step, so as not to scratch the wood. We stacked them in the entryway, right next to the newly secured front door. 7 black trash bags filled with the identity of the 2 people who had treated me like a defective front household appliance. Margaret wiped her brow with the back of her hand, staring at the mountain of bags with a satisfied smile that lit up her wrinkled face. "If you could see your face right now, Constance," she said, chuckling softly. "You look 20 years younger. What are you going to do with all this?" "When they get back, and I assure you it won't be many days before they do, they will find their luggage ready for their permanent move," I replied, leaning against the stair railing to catch my breath. "They'll think you've gone crazy. They'll think it was a fit of rage over what happened this morning." I shook my head slowly. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the tap, and washed my face with cold water. The freezing contact cleared away any remaining trace of doubt in my system. It wasn't a fit of rage, Margaret. Anger is messy, impulsive. Today is the result of methodical observation. They think the trigger was the beach trip, but the trip was just the perfect excuse to execute a plan I mapped out 6 months ago. Margaret frowned, stepping closer to the counter. 6 months? What happened 6 months ago, Constance? I dried my face with a clean towel. I looked my neighbor in the eye and let the third and final negative, the darkest of them all, come to light. It was mid-November of last year. It was cold out. I was in my dark room, the space they hated because it smelled like old chemicals. I had closed the dark wooden door to organize some old tax receipts. They thought I had gone to the grocery store. Fletcher and Lauren were in the hallway, right on the other side of my sanctuary door, talking in low voices, but loud enough that the acoustics of the old house carried every syllable to me with terrifying clarity. "How much longer do we have to put up with this museum decor?" Lauren had complained, her heels echoing on the hardwood. "Your friends are coming over on Friday, and I'm embarrassed for them to see your mother's furniture. And let's not even talk about her mothball smell." "Patience, honey," Fletcher had replied. His voice, the voice of the baby I nursed, the young man whose tuition I paid, sounded cold, calculating, devoid of any affection. The old lady is already 70. She doesn't have much independent time left. While she pays the bills, the mortgage, and the kids' school, we save our own cash. The second she starts losing her mind or her health, we'll stick her in a nice nursing home using her own pension. We sell this outdated mansion, buy the apartment on the north side, and problem solved. You just have to keep smiling at her and let her think she's the boss of the kitchen. She loves feeling useful. I was sitting on my wooden stool, surrounded by darkness, listening to my only son plan my exile and my social death as if he were discussing a real estate transaction. I didn't cry. The pain was so deep, so sharp, that it surpassed the capacity for tears. It was a clean cut to the soul. In that dark room, I realized I wasn't raising a family. I was harboring two parasites patiently waiting for the host to die so they could devour the remains. From that day on, I stopped being the selfless mother and became the cartographer of my own defense. I reviewed every bank statement. I mapped out exactly how they were using my money. I kept the master account isolated, making sure Fletcher only had access to the monthly cash flow I allowed. I played the role of the docile old woman, cooking their pancakes, ironing his white shirts, watching them grow emboldened in their arrogance, waiting for the exact moment when their own greed would leave them vulnerable. The trip to the luxury resort was the stage they built themselves for their own downfall. Margaret listened to me in absolute silence. Her face had lost its smile. Her eyes shined with a mix of horror and deep respect. "My God, Constance," she whispered, bringing a hand to her mouth. "What monsters we sometimes raise, without realizing it. We aren't responsible for the choices they make when they're adults, Margaret. But we are responsible for not leaving a loaded gun in their hands once we discover who they truly are." We finished cleaning the kitchen. I threw the cold pancakes in the trash. I scrubbed the juice stain until the tablecloth was spotless and washed the skillet with boiling water. The house, though emptied of superfluous decorations and guarded by black bags stacked in the entryway, smelled like wood wax and lemon again. It smelled like my home again. Margaret said goodbye in the late afternoon. She assured me she'd leave her living room window open to listen for any noise and that she had her phone handy. I locked the new deadbolt behind her, testing the firmness of the mechanism. I walked into the dining room and sat at the head of the table, a chair I hadn't occupied since Fletcher claimed it 5 years ago, arguing he needed legroom. I opened my manila folder, spreading the signed bank documents across the clean table. The receipts for the frozen account, the records of the fund transfer, the cancellation of the platinum card. Everything was in order. The file was complete. The sun began to set, tinting the inside of the house with shades of orange and red. The wall clock struck 5. It had been almost 4 hours since I spoke to Fletcher on the phone. 4 hours since he, confident in his superiority, walked up to the front desk of the five-star hotel with his haughty wife and their massive suitcases. The cell phone vibrated on the dining room table, shattering the sepulchral silence of the afternoon. I looked at the screen. It wasn't Fletcher. It was an unknown number, an international area code, long and full of zeros. The kind of number used by luxury hotel switchboards or overseas assistance services. I let it ring. The vibration moved the device millimeters across the polished wood. I watched the blinking name on the blank screen with the same coldness a lab tech uses to observe a predictable chemical reaction. The system had worked. The physical card had been declined. The mobile app had shown a zero balance. The public humiliation they had dished out to me in the privacy of my kitchen was now playing out in front of impeccably dressed receptionists and wealthy guests. The phone stopped ringing. The screen went dark. 10 seconds later, it lit up again. This time, the photo I had taken of Fletcher on his graduation day popped up on the screen along with his name. He was calling from his own line, probably using emergency data, desperate. I rested my elbows on the mahogany table, laced my fingers under my chin, and kept my eyes locked on the vibrating phone. The trap had snapped shut with a metallic click, just as final and firm as the new lock on my front door. The spoiled boy who broke bicycles without guilt, and the cold man who planned my exile in a nursing home were about to discover that the woman who developed the photographs, the one who stayed behind cleaning the house, was always the one holding the camera. I took a deep breath, savoring the clean air of my reconquered home, and reached for the phone. The vacation had just begun. I slid my finger across the glass screen to accept the call and brought the device to my ear with deliberate slowness. The silence of my dining room, absolute and protective, contrasted violently with the uproar pouring out of the tiny speaker. I heard the elegant murmur of a hotel lobby, the clinking of glasses in the distance, soft piano music in the background, and over all of that, the ragged, almost suffocating breathing of my son. "Mom," Fletcher yelled. His voice no longer held the bored condescension of that morning. It was loaded with sharp, humiliating panic. "Mom, the bank system is failing. You have to call your branch right now. Tell that manager of yours to fix this disaster." I kept my gaze fixed on the grain of the mahogany wood. I didn't shift my posture. "Good afternoon. Fletcher, did you make it to the hotel? How's the weather on the coast?" "To hell with the weather, Mom," he roared, completely losing his composure, forgetting he was standing in the lobby of a five-star resort. The platinum card bounced. The receptionist ran it through 3 different terminals, and the machine says it's retained for fraud. And that's not the worst part. I opened the app to try and do a direct transfer, and the family fund is at 0. "Zero, Mom. What did you do at the bank?" I propped my elbow on the table and rested my chin in my free hand. I could picture the scene perfectly. Fletcher, in his white linen shirt, wrinkled from the trip, breaking into a cold sweat in front of an imported marble counter. Lauren by his side, with her designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, feeling the stares of the other wealthy guests drilling into them. Recognizing the unmistakable scent of financial rejection. "There is no error in the system, son," I replied, my voice flowing with the calm of an underground river. "I did exactly what I told you I would do. I went to sort out some matters. I blocked the card for unauthorized use and transferred my money, the money from my labor, back to the master account, which you no longer have access to." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. The noise of the lobby seemed to fade as Fletcher's brain tried to process the magnitude of my words. When he spoke again, his pitch had dropped 2 octaves, replacing panic with furious disbelief. "Are you crazy? You canceled my cards while I'm 1,000 miles from home?" "We're at the front desk, Constance. My kids are crying from exhaustion. The bags are on the floor. And a manager in a suit is looking at me like I'm a vagrant who sneaked in to steal towels. Unblock that account immediately." "No." The syllable was short, dry, and sharp as a guillotine drop. It was the first time in 46 years I had given him an absolute no, with no justifications, no apologetic tone, No door left open for negotiation. What do you mean, no? Fletcher stammered, his voice cracking slightly. Mom, this isn't funny. Lauren is about to have a nervous breakdown. The cab from the airport charged us a fortune, and I told him I'd put it on the room. We don't have any cash. We have no way to pay the deposit. We don't even have a way to pay for a flight back if they kick us out of here. You told me this morning that the vacation was just for you guys. Fletcher, I reminded him, savoring every word, feeding him his own poison in exact doses. You told me the money belonged to the family, and that the family was just you, your wife, and your kids. Well, if you are the family, then as the head of that family, it's your job to provide. The trip is yours. The expenses are 2-1. I heard a struggle on the other end, the dull thud of plastic hitting something, followed by Lauren's shrill, hysterical voice. She had snatched the phone from him. Look, lady, my daughter-in-law screamed, losing every filter of fake elegance she had maintained for 5 years. Stop this resentful old woman tantrum. Do us a favor and call the bank to fix this. I am not going to let my kids go through this public humiliation because of your complexes. People are staring at us. I closed my eyes for a second. The image of Lauren pushing my plate of pancakes away with disdain flashed in my mind. Public humiliations are terrible, aren't they, Lauren? I said softly, especially when you have no way to pay the bill for your own arrogance. But don't worry, Fletcher is a genius at managing the banking app from his smartphone. I'm sure he, being so modern and capable, will find a way to solve this without the help of an old woman who's only good for cleaning the house. You are a monster, she shrieked. You left us stranded. No, Lauren, you left me stranded in my own kitchen. I just stopped fueling the getaway car you were using to escape. By the way, tell the kids I love them very much. And I wish you both the best of luck finding a bus back. Oh, and don't call me again. I'm very busy cleaning the house, just like I was ordered to. I didn't wait for her to answer. I pressed the red button on the screen and ended the call. I immediately went into the phone settings and blocked Fletcher and Lauren's numbers. Then I powered the device off completely and left it on the dining room table. The silence returned, but this time, it wasn't an oppressive silence. It was a perfect melody. I got up from the table and walked into the kitchen. The afternoon sun bathed the granite counters in a warm, golden light. For the first time in half a decade, I didn't have to cook separate dinners. I didn't have to listen to complaints about whether the food had too much salt or too little. I didn't have to wash dishes I hadn't dirtied. I went to the pantry and pulled out a bottle of red wine I had bought years ago, which I kept hidden behind the canned goods, so Lauren wouldn't drink it on one of her lazy afternoons. I uncorked it and poured myself a generous glass. That night, I made myself a pan-seared steak with asparagus, my favorite meal, the one I never cooked, because Fletcher didn't like the smell of roasted meat in the house. I ate at the dining room table, savoring every bite, sipping the wine slowly while I watched the 7 black trash bags stacked in my entryway, like plastic sentinels guarding my newly recovered freedom. When it was time for bed, I walked up the stairs. I passed by the room they used to occupy. The door was open. Inside, the beds were unmade, the closets empty, and the air no longer smelled like their expensive perfumes, but of dust and cardboard boxes. I went into my own bedroom on the ground floor, put on my clean cotton nightgown, and slipped between the sheets. I expected to feel guilt. I expected the ghost of maternal love to ambush me in the early hours, tormenting me with images of my grandkids sleeping on plastic airport chairs. But my strategic mind knew the kids were in no real danger. Lauren had parents in another city. Fletcher had friends. Someone would lend them money for a cheap bus ticket. They would suffer discomfort, yes. They would suffer humiliation, of course. But they wouldn't die. The guilt never came. Instead, I experienced a deep, uninterrupted, and restorative sleep. The first real sleep I'd had since Ray left me. Dawn found me in the kitchen brewing coffee in the old Italian mocha pot. The aroma of roasted beans filled the house. It was 7 in the morning. I went out to the backyard with my steaming mug. The grass was green. The rose bushes in the corners needed pruning, but the plants were alive. Just as Fletcher had ordered, I picked up the hose and started watering the dry dirt. The cold water hitting the leaves made a rhythmic, peaceful sound. I was following his orders. I had stayed home and I was watering the plants. Only now, I was doing it as the absolute owner of the land. Mid-morning, the back doorbell rang. Margaret walked in with her usual energy, carrying a plate covered with a cloth. "I made cornbread," she announced, setting it on the kitchen table. "Any news from the front lines, my general?" I sat across from her, pouring her a cup of coffee. "They called yesterday afternoon from the hotel front desk. The card rejection was public and loud. I blocked their numbers. They must have had a very interesting night, trying to scrape together the funds to come back." Margaret let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "I talked to the lady at the corner store, bright and early. She told me she saw Lauren on one of her sister's social media posts complaining that the bank had frozen their accounts due to a supposed computer error and asking for help to buy bus tickets." A bus, Constance. Lady Lauren of the designer bags, traveling 14 hours in a reclining seat, smelling of cheap disinfectant. Divine Justice has a wonderful sense of humor. "They won't be long," I said, glancing at the kitchen clock, which read 11 in the morning. "If they took the overnight bus, they should be pulling into the city right about now. I'll be on my porch watering those fake hanging plants of mine," Margaret said, standing up with a warrior's spark in her eyes. "I wouldn't miss this show for the world. And if they get violent, the neighborhood police patrol drives down our street right at 1 p.m. I'll make sure to flag them down if things get ugly." Margaret left, leaving me alone with the countdown. The next few hours were slow, thick. I walked through the house, making sure everything was in perfect order. There wasn't a trace of them left in the common areas. The house had become mine again, a museum of my own history, with no modern vases or scattered toys. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the unmistakable sound of a tired engine shattered the tranquility of the street. I walked over to the living room window and slightly parted the blinds. A beat-up cab, the kind that operates outside the bus terminal, pulled up to my gate. The doors opened. Fletcher was the first to step out. His linen shirt was no longer white, it was grayish, covered in sweat stains and deep wrinkles. His face reflected brutal exhaustion, but also a suppressed fury that tightened his jaw. Then Lauren got out. She was carrying little Sophie, who was crying at the top of her lungs, and pulling Hudson by the hand. My daughter-in-law's makeup was smeared. Her flawless hair was now a nest of tangles, and she walked with a slight limp, probably from wearing heels on a 14-hour bus ride. The cab driver pulled the two massive suitcases out of the trunk and left them on the sidewalk. Fletcher argued with the driver for a full minute, gesturing wildly before pulling a crumpled wad of bills out of his pocket. "Borrowed, surely," and tossing it through the window. The cab sped off immediately, leaving them alone on the sidewalk under the scorching afternoon sun. I stepped away from the window and walked into the hallway. I stopped in front of the solid wood front door. The new high-security deadbolt gleamed under the light, filtering through the transom. I smoothed out my gray linen skirt, adjusted my silk blouse, and waited. I heard the sound of suitcase wheels dragging up the tiled path. Then, the heavy footsteps on the porch. The metallic scrape of a key sliding into the lock. A second of silence. The sound of the key trying to turn, forcing itself against a mechanism that no longer recognized it. A sharp twist to the left, another to the right, nothing. The metal grinding uselessly. Damn it. I heard Fletcher curse on the other side of the wood. "The key won't turn." "Well, push the door, Fletcher." "For the love of God," Lauren barked, her voice vibrating with pent-up hysteria. "It's boiling out here and the kids are hungry. Open the door." The brass knob was rattled violently. The door didn't even flinch. Arthur's hinges and lock were an impenetrable wall. "Mom." Fletcher's yell pierced the wood, followed by 3 heavy thuds of his fist against the door. "Mom, open the door. The lock is jammed." I didn't move. I let him knock. I let the panic of being locked out compound the humiliation of the hotel and the torture of the bus ride. I wanted them to feel, physically and mentally, what it meant to be on the other side of the border they had drawn themselves. "Constance!" Lauren yelled, slapping the door with an open palm. "We know you're in there. Open up right now. This isn't funny anymore." I took a deep breath. I reached out. I grabbed the latch of the new lock and turned it slowly. The metallic click was loud and clear, silencing the knocking outside. I gripped the knob and pulled the heavy wooden door toward me. Sunlight flooded the hallway, revealing the scene on the porch. Fletcher stood with his arm raised, ready to knock again. Lauren was holding the kids, breathing heavily. Their faces shifted from instant relief to total bewilderment when they saw me. I wasn't wearing the faded floral apron. I was wearing my tailored suit, my pearl earrings, and an expression that belonged to the owner of an empire, not the housemaid. And then, they looked down. They saw the barricade. 7 massive, bulging, heavy black trash bags, almost completely blocking the threshold of the house. What is this?" Fletcher muttered, taking a half-step back, his eyes darting from the bags to my face. "It is the result of my staycation, son," I replied, my voice projecting clear and firm into the hot air. "You told me to stay and clean. I am a woman who always finishes the job she starts. I cleaned the living room, I cleaned the kitchen, and I cleaned the second floor. The house has never been this uncluttered." Lauren set the little girl down and took a step forward, pointing at the bags with a finger trembling with rage. "You put our things in trash bags? Our clothes, my cosmetics, in damn yard bags? You are completely insane. Get out of the way. I am going into my house to bathe my children." Lauren tried to push forward, shoving one of the bags with her knee to force her way in. I didn't move an inch. I planted my feet on the hardwood floor and stared at her with a gaze so glacial she stopped dead in her tracks, crashing into the invisible wall of my authority. "Take one more step onto my property, Lauren, and I swear to you the police will drag you out of here in handcuffs for trespassing," I said, dropping my voice to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "This is not your house. It never was. It was a shelter I lent you out of compassion, which you confused for an early inheritance." Fletcher stepped in, moving in front of his wife, trying to play the last card he had left: emotional blackmail and pity manipulation. "Mom, please," he begged, lowering his hands in a gesture of fake surrender. "I understand you're angry about the trip. I swear I get it. It was a mistake. I was an idiot. I'm asking for your forgiveness. But look at us. We're destroyed. We traveled 14 hours sitting next to the bathroom on a second-class bus. We were thrown out of the hotel like dogs. We have nowhere to go. We are your family. Your grandkids need their beds. You can't do this to us over a tantrum about a trip." I looked him in the eyes. I saw the 12-year-old boy who broke the bike. I saw the young man who ignored me while I cried over his father's debts. I saw the man who ordered me to mop the floor while he spent my savings. "Do not get confused, Fletcher," I said, my voice echoing with the force of 30 years of silent sacrifices. "This has nothing to do with a trip to the beach. The trip was just the stage where you decided to show me your true colors in public. This is about what happened in mid-November of last year." Fletcher's face instantly went pale. The blood drained from his sunburned cheeks. His eyes blinked rapidly, his brain frantically searching through his memories. "November," he stammered. "I don't know what you're talking about." I crossed my arms over my chest. "I was in my darkroom. You two were in the hallway. You thought I had gone to the supermarket. I heard you, Fletcher. I heard perfectly how you comforted your wife by telling her the old lady didn't have much independent time left. I heard your brilliant master plan. Let me keep paying the bills, the food, and the kids' school until my health failed. Then shove me into a nursing home using my own pension. Sell this outdated mansion and buy the apartment on the north side." The silence that fell over the porch was so thick, it nearly drowned out the children's crying. Lauren covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide, terrified as she realized the ground they walked on had disappeared months ago. Fletcher looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. All his arrogance, all his technological certainty, all his generational superiority shattered against the stone wall of my memory. I cleaned your knees when you fell, Fletcher. I paid for your college by standing on my feet through the early morning hours, developing photos of strangers. I opened my doors to you when you went bankrupt, and your gratitude was counting the days until my cognitive decline. Calculating the price of my confinement. Mom, that was just stupid talk. Lauren was stressed. I just wanted to calm her down. I didn't mean it. He tried to make excuses, his voice turning into a pathetic whine. Words are like photographic negatives, son. Once the light touches them, the image is burned in forever. There are no excuses that can erase the exposure. I took a step forward, forcing them to back up toward the edge of the porch. I glanced toward the street. Margaret was standing in her garden, leaning on the fence, watching the scene with a notepad in her hand. A silent witness to the fall of the tyrants. A couple of other neighbors had come out to sweep their driveways, tuning into the drama. The exposure was total. The locks are new, I continued, pointing to the shiny deadbolt on the door. The bank account you had access to no longer exists. The platinum card is a useless piece of plastic. The only things you have on this property are those 7 black bags. Your suitcases are already outside. The kids' things are in separate bags, labeled and carefully folded. Because I don't blame them for the garbage parents they ended up with. But you two will never cross this threshold again, as long as I breathe. And where are we supposed to go? Lauren screamed, crying out of genuine desperation, clinging to Fletcher's arm. We have no money. We have no house. Lauren, you wanted a modern environment without the mothball smell. I'm sure you'll find a fantastic place. Fletcher is the man of the house. I trust he'll solve this from some app on his smartphone. Mom, for God's sake, the kids, he begged, pointing at Hudson and Sophie, who were looking at me with fear. Punish me, but not them. Don't leave them on the street. My grandmother's heart felt a stab of pure pain, a hot needle piercing my chest. I loved those children, but I knew that if I gave in now, if I let them cross the door, the cycle of abuse would never end. They would use them as human shields to regain control. My grandkids will never lack a grandmother, I said, looking softly at the little ones before hardening my gaze back on Fletcher. But today, Hudson and Sophie need to find out what kind of father they have. They need to see how you solve the problems you created yourself, without using the wallet of an old woman you despise. Grab your trash bags, Fletcher. Start walking. I took a step back into my house. I kept a firm grip on the brass knob. Constance, please, Lauren sobbed, taking a step forward, reaching her hand out to me. There were no more words. There was nothing left to say. I grabbed the edge of the heavy solid wood door and pulled it with all my strength. The wood blocked out the sun, blocked out the sobs, and blocked out the pathetic pleas of my son. The solid thud of the door shutting echoed like thunder. I turned the high-security deadbolt, listening to the perfect metallic engagement. I stood in the silent hallway, watching the long afternoon shadows stretch across the clean hardwood floor, while the desperate, muffled pounding began to rain down on the door from the outside, marking the beginning of their new reality. The pounding on the solid wood door continued for exactly 10 minutes. At first, they were heavy, desperate fists, accompanied by Fletcher's hoarse screams demanding I open up, followed by Lauren's shrill shrieks cursing my name. I stood in the hallway, 3 feet from the entrance, with my hands folded over my stomach, listening to the symphony of their collapse. I felt no fear. The reinforced hinges and the security cylinder Arthur had just installed were as unbreakable as my own will. Slowly, the fury on the other side of the wood morphed into exhaustion. The knocking spaced out. The screams turned into tense muttering, into venomous reproaches that were no longer directed at me, but hurled at each other in the sweltering heat of the front porch. I heard Lauren blame Fletcher for not checking the accounts before they traveled. I heard Fletcher blame Lauren for spending so much on the cab and at the airport, for her luxury demands that had left them without cash. The facade of the perfect, modern, superior couple was crumbling mere inches from me, surrounded by 7 black trash bags full of their superficial belongings. I walked slowly into the living room and sat on the couch, letting the silence inside my house wrap around me like a soft, protective blanket. The wall clock kept up its steady ticking, marking the start of my new life. 1 hour passed, then 2. The afternoon heat began to break, giving way to the long evening shadows filtering through the blinds. The back doorbell rang with 2 short, familiar taps. I got up and went to the kitchen. It was Margaret. I opened the screen door for her, and she walked in, rubbing her hands together, her eyes shining with an almost childlike excitement. "They're gone, Constance," she announced, dropping onto one of the granite island stools. "You have to hear this, because it was a show worthy of front-row theater seats." I poured her a glass of cold water and sat across from her, resting my elbows on the clean counter, ready to hear the final report. "Tell me everything, Margaret. I don't want to miss a single detail of the move." My neighbor took a long sip, cleared her throat, and began her account with the precision of a military chronicler reporting on the enemy's retreat. "After you slammed the door in their faces, they stood there, stunned for a good while. Lauren tried to kick one of the trash bags, but since it was full of her own high heels and heavy cream jars, she almost twisted her ankle and ended up crying out of sheer rage. They started screaming at each other right there on the sidewalk. She was calling him useless, asking how it was possible his own mother had left him on the street. Fletcher pulled out his smartphone, that little gadget he bragged about so much, and started making frantic calls. He was pacing back and forth on your garden path, sweating buckets, begging his friends to let them crash at their places. Margaret leaned in, lowering her voice, as if we were sharing a state secret. Apparently, nobody wanted to take in a family of 4 with suitcases and trash bags with 0 notice. Or maybe his friends were already tired of lending him money. Finally, after almost 2 hours of sitting on your curb, this beat-up old truck showed up, one of those cheap freight haulers, with peeling paint and an engine making a horrendous noise. The driver, a guy with a dirty cap and a cigarette in his mouth, helped them load the black bags into the bed of the truck. Lauren was crying from pure humiliation. She climbed into the passenger seat with the little girl on her lap because there was no room. And Fletcher had to ride in the back, out in the open, in the bed of the truck, hugging his trash bags so they wouldn't fall out with the potholes, right next to poor Hudson. They drove out of the neighborhood, hiding their faces, while half the street watched them from their windows. Mrs. Mathilda, from the corner house, even came out with a broom to pretend to sweep, just so she could watch them pass. Cold smile formed on my lips. The symmetry of the universe is relentless when you decide to stop interfering with it to cushion the blows. They had planned my silent exit in an ambulance to a nursing home so they could keep the property. Their exit was in the back of a cheap freight truck, surrounded by their own scraps and exposed to the public scorn of the street they so despised. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, feeling a physical weight, an invisible 5-year anchor, lift entirely off my shoulders. Tonight, I'm sleeping with the windows open. I want to feel the draft of clean air circulating through every corner of this house. That night, I kept my promise. I opened the large living room windows and the ones in the upstairs bedrooms. The cool, early morning air swept away the last traces of their expensive perfumes, the smell of sweat, their panic, and the tension built up in the walls. I slept deeply, without interruptions, without startles, knowing my fortress was impregnable. The next morning, my true reconstruction began. I didn't waste time on useless lamentations. I had grieved the son I thought I had, processing it in absolute silence over the last 6 months, ever since that dark November afternoon in the darkroom. Now it was time to reclaim my territory. Inch by inch, I called a trusted crew of professional painters. For 3 days, the house was filled with the smell of fresh paint, masking tape, and honest work. I had the guest room, the one they had turned into a chaos of plastic toys and discarded clothes, painted a bright, pearly white. I threw out the heavy blackout curtains Lauren had installed to block the sun, and I hung light linen drapes that let the natural light flood in, illuminating corners that had been stuck in the gloom. I went to the garage, turned on the bare overhead bulb, and knelt in front of the dusty cardboard boxes where I had been exiled. I pulled out, one by one, the silver frames that held my history. The portrait of my parents, intact despite the broken glass I had replaced years ago. The photographs of my first trips abroad. My old medium-format camera, heavy and solid, which I wiped down with a microfiber cloth until the metal and the lens shined like new. I carried it all back to the living room. I tossed the massive modern ceramic vase they had left behind straight into the recycling bin on the street, and I arranged my photographs on the large mahogany console, restoring the altar of my own life in the main entryway. The first week passed in a whirlwind of physical activity that brought vitality back to my joints. I bought fresh flowers for the vases. I washed all the sofa covers with lavender fabric softener and stocked the pantry exclusively with the foods I liked. No one demanded pancakes at 6 in the morning. No one spilled coffee on my clean tablecloths. No one gave me grief about the smell of mothballs. The silence was exquisite company, a melody I learned to savor with every cup of tea I drank by the kitchen window, watching my rose bushes bloom under the sun. On Thursday of the second week, I put on my navy blue tailored suit, pulled my hair back neatly, and took a cab to the financial district. The bank branch was just as cold and bustling as the last time, but my step across the marble floor was much lighter and more dominant. The reception assistant recognized me immediately and waved me through without waiting for the system to authorize it. Ernest Sterling welcomed me into his mahogany office, shaking my hand with a smile of professional complicity and absolute respect. "Constance, so good to see you. I assume the operational adjustments we made last week had the desired effect during the family vacation." I sat in the leather chair, placing my purse on my lap with measured movements. "They worked perfectly, Ernest. The surgery was a total success. The patient is free of the parasitic tumor. But today, I am here to establish a long-term preventative treatment. I don't want to leave any loose ends that they might try to exploit in the future." I pulled out a new manila folder, thinner this time, and slid it across the polished desk. "I want to set up a closed, irrevocable educational trust for my grandkids, Hudson and Sophie Villeda. I want a portion of my funds dedicated exclusively to paying their school tuitions, their books, and their uniforms until they finish college. But the rules must be forged in iron, Ernest." The manager put on his reading glasses, paying absolute attention to my words, fully aware of the gravity of the financial structure I was about to order. "You dictate the rules, Constance. I'll draft them, and we will make them legally bulletproof. The money will never pass through Fletcher's or Lauren's hands. Not a single liquid cent will reach their checking accounts. The bank will make the transfers directly to the educational institutions upon presentation of the official stamped invoice. If they need uniforms, the bank will pay the supply store. If they need books, it will be transferred to the bookstore's account. The parents will not be authorized signatories. They will not be able to request cash refunds under any excuse of an emergency, and they will not have access to the trust's bank statements to use as collateral for personal loans. If they try to cancel a school enrollment to demand a refund and keep the cash, the contract must stipulate that the funds automatically return to my individual master account." Ernest nodded slowly, taking quick notes in his leather notebook, admiring the architecture of my defense. The precision of my request didn't surprise him. He had known my methodical mind for 15 years. It's a direct pay structure that is very common in hostile divorces or bulletproof inheritances, where addictions are involved. "It is perfectly viable, Constance. We will lock the fund down so your son cannot touch it under any circumstance, not even by claiming legal representation of the minors in a case of extreme need. Furthermore," I added, looking him dead in the eye, making sure he understood the finality of my visit, "I want to leave my updated will on file here and with the bank's head notary. The house, the remaining accounts, and all my liquid assets will pass to a local charity dedicated to the care of abandoned elderly people at the exact moment of my death. Fletcher Villeda is expressly disinherited due to a lack of moral integrity. He will not receive the wooden furniture he despises so much, nor the spoons from the kitchen. Everything will be liquidated and donated. Ernest set his pen down on the desk. There was a moment of respectful silence in the closed office. He knew how hard it was for a mother to make that drastic decision, but he also saw the unbreakable firmness in my posture, the total absence of doubt in my eyes. I will prepare the documents immediately, Constance. You will need to come in next week with 2 independent witnesses for the notarized signature. I will bring my neighbor Margaret and Arthur, the locksmith. They are the most loyal people I know. I walked out of the bank with the absolute certainty that my wall was complete. There were no longer any cracks through which they could drain my hard work. My grandchildren's future was secured in the essentials, protecting them from their parents' incompetence and negligence, but guaranteeing that my son could not use my love for the kids as a bargaining chip for his own benefit. The months began to roll by, turning the sweltering summer into a mild fall and then into a gentle winter. My life settled into a routine of absolute peace. I took up photography again, but this time for pure pleasure, not survival. I turned the old kids' room, now white and bright, into a natural light studio, where I spent my afternoons capturing the texture of the dry leaves from my garden, the profiles of the birds that visited the porch, and the wrinkles full of history on the faces of my neighborhood friends. I started selling some of these framed pieces to a small local art gallery. I didn't do it for the money, which was already secured, but for the simple, profound joy of knowing my hands were still capable of capturing the beauty of the world without having to please impatient clients. News about Fletcher and Lauren reached me punctually through Margaret's infallible intelligence system. The neighborhood always has eyes everywhere, and the branching networks of gossip are more efficient than any satellite spy grid. One November afternoon, exactly a year after I overheard that fatal conversation in the hallway, Margaret walked into my kitchen with a tray of freshly baked butter cookies and an expression of poorly hidden triumph on her face. "I went to that new mall on the north side yesterday afternoon," she commented, pouring herself a cup of chamomile tea from my porcelain teapot. "I needed to buy a gift for my niece." I walked past the cosmetics section of that giant department store. Guess who I saw behind the free perfume sample counter? Standing there, looking like she was at a funeral. I set my camera down on the kitchen table and looked at her, raising an eyebrow with genuine interest. "You don't say." "Oh, I do say," Margaret laughed, taking a bite of her cookie. "Lauren." She was wearing the mandatory store uniform, this hideous black polyester jacket that was too big on her, and black low-heeled shoes, the orthopedic kind worn by employees who stand for 10 hours. She was handing out scented paper strips to customers rushing by. She looked exhausted, Constance. Her dark roots were screaming for an expensive dye job she can no longer afford. I walked right up to the counter, took a perfume strip straight from her tray, looked her in the eyes, smiled, and said, "What a modern environment you have here, dear. Much better than smelling like mothballs in a borrowed house." I let out a brief, dry, sincere laugh. The irony was so fine it could almost be cut with the butter knife. My friend's returned insult was poetic. And what did the lady of the designer bags say to that? She turned as red as a ripe tomato, her eyes filled with tears of rage. But since the floor manager was watching her, she looked down, swallowed hard, and turned around to help someone else, playing dumb. I found out from the butcher's cousin, whose brother-in-law works with Fletcher at the same insurance office, that they are renting a tiny 2-bedroom apartment in a pretty loud and dangerous neighborhood down south. Fletcher had to take out a loan with sky-high interest from a non-bank lender to pay the security deposit, because his credit history was completely ruined when you blocked the platinum card and those massive hotel charges bounced in the international system. Now he works extra shifts every weekend just to pay for groceries and the light bill. Margaret's detailed report didn't bring me vulgar joy, but it delivered a deep, cold, and silent satisfaction. The scales had balanced with mathematical exactness. The universe was charging them the real rent of adult life, that cost of survival I had subsidized for half a decade at the expense of my own dignity and physical wear. And the kids? I asked, feeling that small, unavoidable pinch in my chest that never entirely went away when it came to my innocent blood. The kids are fine. The school confirmed tuition is paid for the whole year, thanks to direct transfers from your bank. Hudson is getting huge. He plays soccer on the school team, and little Sophie is just as rambunctious as ever. They have new uniforms and all their books. I nodded, taking a sip of tea. I had established a strict, non-negotiable rule regarding my grandkids. I did not allow Fletcher or Lauren to bring them to my house under any circumstances. My home was my sanctuary, my safe space, and the presence of their parents would contaminate the air it had cost me so much to purify. Instead, I had agreed to see the kids once a month on entirely neutral ground. The Sunday after Margaret's visit, I got ready for my monthly meetup. I put on an impeccably tailored camel wool coat, a silk scarf, and comfortable shoes. I drove my own car, a modest model, but with an engine in perfect condition that I had started using regularly again, to the city's large central park, a place full of families, ancient trees, and ice cream carts. I arrived at the swing set area at exactly 3 in the afternoon, the time agreed upon via text message. I sat on a wooden bench under the shade of a massive oak tree with a large wax paper bag full of the kids' favorite candies, a couple of illustrated storybooks, and 2 small handcrafted wooden toys. 10 minutes later, I saw Fletcher walking down the white gravel path. He was holding Hudson and Sophie by the hands. My son looked like he had aged 5 years in the last 12 months. His posture, once upright, arrogant, and owning the world, was now hunched under the crushing weight of the real responsibility of maintaining a family. He wore a jacket worn out at the elbows and jeans that had seen better days. The haughtiness in his jaw had vanished, replaced by an expression of perpetual submission and chronic fatigue. The kids saw me from a distance and ran toward me, letting go of their father's hands with genuine enthusiasm. "Grandma!" Sophie yelled, throwing herself into my arms with such force she almost knocked me over. Hudson arrived a second later, hugging me around the waist and burying his face in my coat. I squeezed them against my chest, feeling the warmth of their little bodies, breathing in the smell of the cheap kids' shampoo they used now. I handed them the bag of candy and the gifts and sent them off to play on the wooden ball swing structure, warning them with a smile not to run too fast. Fletcher stood in front of me, a few feet away, like a beggar awaiting an audience with a queen. I kept my hands folded in my lap. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice dull, raspy, and devoid of any vital energy. "You look really good. That coat is new. Rest works wonders, Fletcher, and not having to clean up the messes of irresponsible adults in my own kitchen does even more." He looked down at his worn-out shoes. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, rubbing the fabric nervously, swaying slightly on his heels. "I wanted to thank you for the school thing. The principal sent us the notice that the trust covers absolutely everything this year. It's a huge help. Lauren and I, well, we're going through a pretty rough patch. The rent is drowning us. Prices went up, and the car engine started acting up. It needs urgent repairs, or I'll be on foot getting to work." I raised my right hand, stopping his words in the air with the same efficiency a brick wall stops a direct hit. My face remained impassive, made of stone, showing not a single drop of the pity he was desperately trying to squeeze from my mother's heart. "The trust is for the comprehensive education of my grandchildren, Fletcher. It is not a life preserver for your bad financial decisions of the past, nor a consolation prize for your failure. What you do with your personal expenses, your rent down south, or the mechanics of your vehicle is a problem exclusively for the man of the house. And as you made perfectly clear a year ago, you are the absolute boss of your family. Mom, please, I'm just asking for a small loan, an advance. I'll pay you back in full as soon as I get my year-end bonus at the office. I swear on my life." We're sleeping in an apartment that smells like mold every time it rains. I looked at him with the clinical coldness of a camera lens, adjusting the focus on a pathetic subject in a bleak landscape. It smells like mold? What a shame. I suppose you'll have to buy a good air freshener at the supermarket. Or maybe Lauren can bring home more free perfume samples from the mall counter to mask it on the walls. Fletcher closed his eyes, absorbing the direct hit of my knowledge regarding his work and living situation. The color drained completely from his face. He understood, in that second of humiliation in the public park, that I knew exactly where they were, what they were doing, and how low they had fallen. He understood that my information network was vastly superior to any technological app he could manage on his phone. There are no loans, Fletcher. There are no extensions on blocked cards. There are no emergency transfers. I gave you my house, my lifelong money, and my unconditional service for 5 years. And you paid me back by planning my confinement in a nursing home and ordering me to mop the floor while you went on a luxury vacation with my savings. The faucet of empathy is turned off forever. Enjoy the independent life you built with your own hands. I didn't wait for his reply. I stood up from the wooden bench, adjusted the belt of my coat, and walked toward the sandbox area. I spent the next hour pushing Sophie on the highest swing, listening to Hudson tell me about his science projects at school, and laughing with them under the warm afternoon sun. Fletcher remained seated on a distant bench, watching us in silence, reduced to the role of a simple, miserable spectator in the life of a family he himself had destroyed out of greed and arrogance. When the agreed time came to leave, I kissed my grandkids' sweaty foreheads, promised to see them next month at the same time, and walked toward my car parked on the avenue without looking back. There were no goodbyes for my son. My silence was the only language he deserved to hear from me for the rest of his life. I drove back to my quiet street. The sunset was starting to dye the sky in brilliant shades of purple and orange. I parked in the driveway, took out my security keys, and opened the front door. The metallic click of the deadbolt, that exact sound that marked the beginning of my liberation a year ago, welcomed me. The house greeted me with the smell of waxed wood, fresh flowers, and absolute peace. I left my coat on the entryway rack and walked straight down the back hallway. I opened the heavy dark wooden door of my darkroom, walked in, and closed the door behind me, submerging myself in the comforting darkness of isolation. I turned on the red safe light, and the room was bathed in that familiar, ancient scarlet glow. I had spent the morning taking photographs in the garden, and I needed to develop a roll of black and white film. I prepped the plastic trays with the chemicals, the developer, the stop bath, and the fixer. The acrid, metallic smell filled my lungs, an aroma that to others was deeply unpleasant or outdated, but to me was the perfume of my independence, the smell of the honest work that raised and paid for the walls surrounding me. I extracted the negative from the metal spiral of the developing tank, carefully cut it into strips using sharp scissors, and placed it in the enlarger's negative carrier. I adjusted the lens focus over the blank photographic paper, calculating the exposure time with the precision of someone who has done this process thousands of times in the dark, exactly 15 seconds of projected light. I picked up the exposed photo paper with bamboo tongs and submerged it in the first tray. The developing liquid covered the white surface completely. I leaned over the tray, watching under the red light as the magic of chemistry did its usual work. Slowly, the shapes began to emerge from the nothingness of the paper. First, the densest shadows, then the midtones, and finally, the sharp, hard, clear details. It wasn't a portrait of a stranger's family smiling falsely for a Christmas card. It wasn't the image of an ungrateful son or a haughty daughter-in-law. It was a perfect photograph of the facade of my own house. The solid wood front door, firmly closed, with the porch clean and completely uncluttered under the morning sunlight. The rose bushes, blooming in the bottom corners of the frame, strong and rooted in the dirt I watered myself every morning. An impenetrable fortress that belonged solely and exclusively to me. I moved the paper to the stop bath to instantly halt the chemical reaction, and then submerged it in the fixer. The image became permanent, unalterable, immune to the passage of time and to the lies of others. I took the wet photograph by the corner with the tongs and hung it on the drying line that crossed the room, securing it with a small wooden peg. The water dripped slowly from the bottom edge of the paper onto the tiled floor, marking the seconds with a soft, rhythmic, minuscule sound in the midst of perfect silence. Plip, plip. I stood there in the scarlet silence of my sanctuary, observing the sharp image of my finished home. I had cleaned the house exactly as I was ordered to, and in doing so, I had swept away every last particle of my former submission. I turned off the red light. The darkness was total, but I knew the way out by heart.